We begin this hour with the ongoing crisis in Venezuela continuing. The country is still being held accountable for paying back its debts. And the South American country is turning to a precious metal in order to do so. RT Sara Montes joins me. So, Sara, does Venezuela have any gold left?
Well, Scottie, despite the issues that they had to extract their gold from the Bank of England earlier this year, it seems like Venezuela still has some of the precious metal left. Now, let me bring you up to speed. Back in 2015, Venezuela borrowed $1.1 billion from Citigroup. They missed a deadline to repay that debt by March 11th. Now, Citigroup now plans to sell several tons of gold placed as collateral by Venezuelan central bank on the $1.1 billion loan. Now, the bank also plans to sell the gold as a guarantee, but it now has a market value of over $1.3 billion. So Citigroup plans to deposit the excess of approximately $258 million into a New York bank. Now, the current economic situation and financial sanctions have made it even harder for the Maduro government to pay back some of these sovereign loans. The imposed sanctions by the U.S. and Europe are already hurting the country. The United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights expressed her concern over the sanctions.
Although this pervasive and devastating economic and social crisis began before the imposition of the first economic sanctions in 2017, I am concerned that the recent sanction financial transfer related to the sale of Venezuelan oil within the United States may contribute to aggravating the economic crisis with possible repercussions on people's basic rights and well-being.
Now, the U.S. had already cut back on a lot of their oil exports since January. That's when President Trump hit the country's oil exports. Maduro said the U.S. is leading a coup aimed at stealing the world's largest oil reserves. But U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Carrie Filippetti, said the humanitarian crisis has been ongoing for years. The sanctions are absolutely not the cause of the humanitarian crisis. Now, Filippetti also noted Venezuela's hyperinflation and the millions of people who have already left the country. But some say the sanctions on the country are also affected Caribbean and Central American nations who depended on a stable flow of oil from Venezuela. Now, the Petrocaribe Oil Alliance with Venezuela was a generous deal. This only allowed for 60% to be paid up front and the remaining 40% to be paid off over 25 years with only 1% interest. This also allowed countries like Haiti and Jamaica to use their savings to fund social projects for the poor. Now, Venezuela had too relied on these countries to remain political allies, but critics say that deal had been dead for at least a year and that these countries should have seen it coming. Scottie, as Venezuela is now having a harder time relying on these oil exports, what's left of their gold is now more precious than ever, and it continues to deplete, especially since Maduro used about 40% of their gold on some of these debts and on funding government programs just last year.
We now go to investigative journalist Ben Swann to learn more. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Yeah, Scottie, thanks for having me on. And by the way, Hugo Chavez probably spinning in his grave. He spent a lot of time trying to repatriate that gold back into Venezuela.
Absolutely. The idea of Donald Duck or Scrooge McDuck in my mind comes up with someone diving down within all these gold coins, but that's not exactly what's happening. But you do have Citigroup, who has made this decision during the political turmoil in Venezuela. Why would they do this? It doesn't seem to be helping anything.
No, it's a very strange decision for Citigroup to do this, and a couple of thoughts on that. Number one, when Citigroup obviously decided to do this, they've been talking about whether or not they would take this action really since February on two different levels. One, they've been talking to the Guaido camp. Guaido's people essentially have reached out to Citigroup and asked them not to do this because they said it would cost Venezuela gold, and they want to keep those resources in the event that Guaido does become president of the country. On the other hand, Citigroup has been meeting with U.S. Treasury Department officials since February, trying to figure out a course of action for how they would be able to do this, because obviously there's all kinds of issues with sanctions and Citigroup not wanting to do anything that's perceived as crossing U.S. sanctions. So the fact that Citigroup decided to go ahead and take this action indicates that there had to have been some kind of prompt, I would say, by the U.S. government to say, go ahead and do this, you'll get some cover.
Well, that's the thing. Is this a common practice when a nation cannot make good on their debts?
It does happen at times. What's kind of interesting is, I've been looking into this throughout the day today to see what other countries this has happened with. And there are a number of countries that obviously, have sovereign defaults where they default on some kind of loan or some kind of bond that they owe. In fact, I found this, that Venezuela and Ecuador actually have 10 defaults each in modern times. Venezuela actually has the most, approximately $65 million in bond payments. They defaulted on those back in 2017. So it happens with different countries around the world at different times. I think what's unique about this situation is that you had this loan essentially that was made using gold as collateral. The value of the gold at the time that the loan was made in 2015 was about $1.1 billion. Today it's worth about $1.3 billion. And so there's a difference here of about $285 million. According to the terms of the agreement, Citigroup is now supposed to hand over that additional $285 million, the increased value over time, back to Venezuela. And this is where the Treasury Department comes in. Instead of doing that and abiding by the contract that they have with the nation of Venezuela, Citigroup, I keep calling it Citibank, but Citigroup essentially is taking that money and putting it into a bank account in New York. And I can say with great certainty that has happened under the direction of the U.S. Treasury to keep them from being in violation of U.S. sanctions.
Well, that's my thought right now. If this is money that is actually owed because it's interest, just like you and I when we take out an investment in a bank on our own, if we take out a CD or any other kind of bond, that's what we're doing. We're hoping to get that interest back and it will come back to us. And yet in this case, it's going to another party, possibly to be given to the opposition of the party that actually made the initial investment. Something doesn't seem legal, but where do you go to appeal that? Who do you actually go? There's not like there's a Supreme Court of the world to handle this kind of question.
Yeah, essentially, Venezuela could, I guess, sue an international court. That might take years to get anywhere, if it ever got anywhere at all. So, yeah, they're really stuck right now.
Well, besides gold, we're also talking about crude. And Venezuela's crude shipments to the U.S. hit zero last week. How big of an issue is this, do you think, for the Venezuelan economy?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty big issue. Consider the fact that the U.S. has not had a single month go by where it has not purchased Venezuelan crude since 1973. Wow. So it's been a very, very long time since that's taken place. The U.S. was, until September of last year, still the #1 purchaser of Venezuelan crude in the entire world. That was in September. In February, when the U.S. really began to apply these new sets of sanctions, India stepped up and became kind of the new purchaser of that oil. So it will have an enormous effect, I think, on the Venezuelan economy to see at least 30% of your crude oil, the customer for that, disappear overnight.
Well, this is definitely trickle-down economics of a negative proportion. It'll be definitely sped up. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
Yeah, Scottie, thank you.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.